Hey guys, so it has been a long time since I did one of my Bible study videos, and I'm so excited to start out the new year with more of a consistent posting schedule. We're going to start out in the book of Esther, but before we jump in, I just want to let you know that all the links that you need are going to be down in the description box below, including a link to a blog post that talks in depth about what tools I use, how I make these Bible studies, why there's no comments allowed on these videos anymore, things like that. So if you're curious or if you've watched my Bible study videos before, that's a really good resource. Also in the link below is all of the notes for these Bible studies. So if you want to follow along, you can actually print down, save, copy, whatever you need to do with those notes. That way you have verse by verse what I'm going off of. I'm not going to touch on every single one in the video because it would be incredibly long, but I highly encourage you to do your own research, read different versions of the Bible as always. And before we jump into chapter 1 of Esther, I recommend that you read the chapter 1 and the whole book if you have time. But read chapter 1 especially, and then if you need just a quick overview, if you've never read it before, not familiar with the book of Esther, I really recommend the Bible Study Project. I linked to their Esther video down below as well, because it is just a really good overview and a summary of the book as a whole, so you kind of know from the beginning what you're kind of looking at and why these events are important. Okay, that is it. I will jump right in. I'll see you guys inside. All right, so the book of Esther is a really cool book. It's one of the only books in the Bible that does not mention God by name. So even though his name is never mentioned, they never say, my God, they never pray, they never do anything directly to or for God. God works in the background of this book throughout the entire thing, and we're gonna kind of look at that as a theme throughout these study videos. Just that God is kind of the behind the scene maker of this entire story. So, chapter 1 opens up with King Xerxes in Persia, and if you don't really know too much about the history of this, think to some movies that are kind of during that time period, the movie 𝗵'𝗺 that's set during this time. It's a really violent time. The Jews are in exile, living among people who don't have the same faith as them. And so a lot of them, just kind of keep their heads down. They keep to themselves. They follow the laws of the land, but they're still praying and praising their God among people who are, fighting, and there's wars going on, and it's a really violent time. So keep that in the back of your mind as a historical context for this. And let's go ahead and dig right in. So in some versions of the Bible, it'll say Xerxes. The version that I'm using for this study is the New International Version. But your version might say Ahasuerus. Excuse the pronunciations of some of these names. He was the king of the Persian Empire. He's just well known as King Xerxes. So that's the name that's in a lot of text. He was just incredibly powerful. A lot of people saw him as a god. So during this time, I'm going to say think of a movie like 𝗵'𝗺. King was like a god. So then in verse 2, Susa or Shushan is just east of Babylon. It's in one of the 3 capitals of the Persian Empire during this time. So that's kind of where they are. In the 3rd verse, this is the first of 10 different feasts in the book of Esther. And these feasts are very important theme markers throughout this story. And we're going to see more about that through the chapters. But note that this is the first of 10 feasts. So I'm just going to make a little note on that. And if you guys don't already, or if you're not already familiar with the historical context of the Bible, or even the maps and where these things are happening, I really recommend that you just kind of research some of those. A lot of times having the historical context really helps you get a better understanding of why things are happening in different stories. There's a lot of times in the Bible where the Jews are in exile, and that's because they're being displaced by these other nations that have risen up. So understanding like the history of this time period and stuff can be really helpful for understanding why certain events are happening and why they're in exile and where they are and things like that. And you can just do a simple Google search for those kinds of things. Okay, so verse 4. The feast was a drunken party, essentially, to show off Xerxes' riches and power. The Hebrew word for a feast that's used here is, I'm going to butcher this, 𝗵𝗂𝗽, which actually derives from the Hebrew verb to drink. So these are just drunken parties, lots of liquor and stuff. There's actually like an law in place that says like you should drink as much as you can at these parties. So these are not just like feasts, they are all out drunken madness. Okay, now there is a second feast for all the people in the capital city. We see that in verse 5, and that lasts 7 days. It's in the king's palace, and the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa attended. So this feast is described in detail, and the reason for that is because the author of Esther is showing off the wealth of King Xerxes, showing off his power, showing off kind of the extent of his kingdom. So this is a super long description here in 6 through 7 essentially, and that is because we are seeing more of his wealth and power. In verse 8, it also talks about, verse 7 and 8, I guess, that the wine was served generously at this party. This is another show off of the king's wealth, and again, relating back to that Hebrew word that actually derives from the word to drink. So they are drinking lots of wine. Each guest, in verse 8, this is what I was talking about, was allowed to drink as much as they wanted, since the law literally stated that there's no restraint on how much you could drink. So each guest could drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So basically verse 1 through 8 is just kind of a look at the king's kind of establishment of this kingdom. It's how he rules, it's how he parties. He believes himself to be very wealthy and powerful, and he is, and that's why many people see him as a god. So then we get into verse 9, and this is where we meet Xerxes' wife, Queen Vashti. She throws a third feast only for the women, and there were most likely other feasts as well where women were allowed. It's not like the women weren't allowed at the other feast, but this one is strictly for women. So we will make this third of 10 feasts. Okay, and then in verse 10, on the 7th day when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So the king obviously is just showing off here. Merry with wine in the Bible often, almost always, means drunk. So King Xerxes asked his eunuchs, and eunuchs are men that were in position and power, such as like the king's cupbearers, or the caretakers of the royal wives, or the caretakers of the concubines. And we'll see more of the eunuchs kind of throughout the story, especially when dealing with Esther. But basically he asks for his wife to be brought to him. And then in verse 11, there's kind of a debate about what the king was asking here. Some people believe that King Xerxes asked Vashti to come to the feast wearing only her crown, from the show off her beauty, essentially having her come naked and kind of publicly embarrassing her. Others believe that he was simply just asking her to appear at a normal function as his wife. I have some study questions that'll kind of go into this a little bit, but really, regardless of why she refused, Vashti says no. So we see that in verse 12, and I'll just make a couple of notes here. Okay, so regardless of why she refused, Vashti says no. And he is essentially embarrassed in front of everyone who's supposed to be obeying him without question. His own wife disobeys him, and he's supposed to be commanding this massive kingdom. So not only does it embarrass him, but it kind of undermines his power. And this entire time, we've been looking at him showing off his power. So this is kind of a direct attack on him and who he believes he is. And so he becomes furious and burns with anger. So then we get into verse 13. It was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice. He spoke with the wise men. The wise men were also often called princes. You might see that in some versions of your Bible. Let's make a quick note here. Who understand the times and were closest to the king. Also, you might notice that there's a lot of themes of seven. There's the seventh day of the feast, the 7 eunuchs, the 7 wise men, etc. All of these are pointing at God's presence without ever mentioning God in this entire book of the Bible. So if you wanted to, you could even go through here and highlight all of the 7s because there's a lot of them. So it's kind of a nod to that. And my version actually doesn't say the 7 wise men, but there are 7 names listed here. Okay. So Xerxes asks his wise men what Vashti's punishment should be for disobeying him. He says that she has not obeyed his command and that the eunuchs have taken to her. One of his wise men suggests a decree based on the idea that she has not only disrespected the king, but the nation as a whole. And this is a wild exaggeration that just kind of legitimizes really poor advice from his advisors. The king is wise to go to advisors for, consultations and to decide kind of how to handle this situation, especially people who might be more familiar in the law than him. But one of his advisors said that it's not only against the king that she has done wrong, but against all the nobles and all the peoples of all provinces. It will be known to women, and they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she would not come. So this guy is basically suggesting that because of this one incident, the entire kingdom will fall into shambles because wives across the nation will stop listening to their husbands, and they'll stop respecting the king. Obviously, this is going to hit the king's pride. He's obviously a powerful and prideful man, so he kind of takes this advice to heart. Okay, so that poor advice leads to the decree in verse 20, which we'll get to in just a moment. But basically, the wise men suggest that if Vashti can disobey, any woman can, which will result in contempt and anger throughout the kingdom. Vashti is no longer referred to as queen, you might notice, especially in verse 19. Basically, what they are saying is that she's now just Vashti. The wise men have basically suggested a law be written into the law of the Persians and the Mendes. Mendes? I'm not sure how to say that either. I'm sorry. Basically, this suggests that the law would not be able to be overturned by King Xerxes or anyone else. The way that the decrees and the laws of Persia work is that once written into law, they cannot be changed. And this becomes very important later in the story. So for now, I'm just going to put a big star by this, and we will come back to it in one of the later videos. So then in verse 20, when the king's edict proclaimed throughout all of the realm, all women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. This is with a bit of irony. The wise men suggest that the king should issue a decree that women must honor their husbands, but obviously King Xerxes had no power over Vashti's disobedience. So it's just a bit of irony there. Verse 21, Xerxes then agrees with the wise men's suggestion. The decree is signed and sent out to all the provinces, and the chapter ends with that. So this first chapter is kind of an introduction. Esther's never mentioned, God's never mentioned, but it's all setting up this wild story that is going to put Esther in the position to be made queen later on. So again, like I said, I highly recommend that you just read through this whole book before watching any other videos. I'm going to publish these videos once a week So if you are watching this far in advance, you can just binge them all. But if not, just do your own research and kind of read through it as you go, even if you just do one video a week. We'll get through this in a pretty quick amount of time. So now I'm just going to use a couple of different pens to highlight a few important things. You can do this however you would like in your Bible. These pens are the Tombow pens. They kind of soak through, I'm not gonna lie, but I don't mind the shadowing too much, so I'm just gonna use them anyway. All right, you guys, that is it for chapter 1. Thank you for going through this with me. If you guys have any questions about this, please refer to that blog post. You can leave comments on the blog post, or you're free to always email me. And then if you guys have any suggestions for what I should do with my Bible cover, let me know. I'm trying to decide if I want to paint it, just leave it, do like a cover on it, but let me know, because I kind of can't decide what to do. So leave a comment on the blog post if you have any questions, and I will see you guys next week for Esther chapter 2. Thanks for watching.